So today's daf is daf Kuf Gimel. We're again one ahead of daf Yomi, and Mirz Hashem will start at least the Mishnah of the eighth parak. Ochal Ever Minachai on the top of the Omud. Minat Treifa. So now we have an overlap of two different lavim. And the question is, how many sets of malchus do you get? There's both Ever Minachai and Treifa. Now the animal becomes treifa after it's born. The Gemara is going to have one case where it became treifa exactly at the point of its birth, but as a general rule, the animal became treifa later on, after it was born. The question is, when does Ever Menachai set in? And Rabbi Yochanan Omar Chayv Shtayim, that somehow we would say the following, that both Ever Menachai and treifa are chal. Rav Shimon ben Lakish Omer, Eino chayv al achas. According to Rav Shimon ben Lakish, it would seem that the Iser Ever Menachai is chal before the Iser treifa, and then we apply the principle of Ein Iser chal Iser. But the Gemara has a different approach, a different logic. Bishlei Miller Rabbi Yochanan Nicha, I understand Rabbi Yochanan why he should get two sets of malchus. Now let's explain. The Gemara had postulated on Daf Kuf Beis Amid Beis that there are two different lavim in the Torah and two different isurim. One is Ever Menachai and the other is treifa. Treifa comes from a different pasuk. Basa v'asad treifa lo tochelu. So we certainly have two different isurim. And even Reish Lakish agrees that there are two different isurim. And therefore the Gemara raises the following question, El Rav Shimon ben Lakish Kasha. So right now the Gemara is focused exclusively on the question of whether or not there are two different isurim. And even Rav Shimon ben Lakish would have to admit, and as we saw in the previous Omud, he does admit that treifa and Ever Menachai are two separate psukim, and therefore they're two independent lavin. But now the Gemara is going to analyze this sugya of Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish from the perspective of Ein Iser Chal Iser. Omer of Yosef, Lo Kasha. I understand Reish Lakish very well, and the machlokas between him and Rabbi Yochanan can be understood as kan bebehema achas, kan b'shtei behemos. If there are two different animals, one animal is a treifa, and he eats, let's say, a kazayis from the treifa. The other animal, he plucks off a limb and eats a kazayis, or a full limb, from a living animal. So if he had two asros, then he gets two sets of malchus, and b'shtei behemos even Reish Lakish would concede. But the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is in one behema. And if it's one behema, the question is, can you get two malchus for violating two lavim in one behema? And the Gemara says, according to both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, in the case of two behemoths, you get two sets of malchus, but the machlokus is bebehema achas, pligi. So what is the machlokus in one animal? Bebehema achas my pligi. Omer Abaye kigon shenitrafa im yitzias ruba. Let's say the animal became treifa immediately at the point of halachic birth. Halachic birth is when the fetus emerges from the womb of its mother, at least ruba, most of the fetus. That's called leda. And at that very moment that the fetus popped its head out of the womb of its mother, it got some sort of an injury that made it a treifa. But now the question is, when did the Isur Eivim and Achai set in? Mar Sovar, Rabbi Yochanan is going to say that Behema B'chayel Levarim Omedes, and therefore, as we'll explain in a minute, Isur Treif of Isur Eivim and Achai Bahadi Adodikos. Rabbi Yochanan says you cannot apply the principle of Ein Isur Chal Isur in a case where both Isurim emerge and are validated simultaneously. And if we hold that Behema B'chayel Levar Medes, it means that the Isur Eivim and Achai is Chal on every single limb of the live animal, even before you pluck that limb off and separate it from the animal. Because from the get-go, he expects to take apart all the limbs after the animal dies, and therefore, even in its lifetime, anticipating that he's going to separate all the limbs, each limb is a separate entity, and it's also, and it has a Chal Shem Isur of Eivim and Achai, even before he actually plucks it away. So therefore, from the very moment that the animal is born, each one of its Eivarim is prohibited and has a Chal Shem Eivim and Achai. And at that very moment when it was born, when Yotza Ruba, the fetus, exited from its mother's womb, at that point it was fatally injured, and now it became a treifa. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says you get two sets of malchus, because both Isurim, not only do they come from two different psukim, but they were chal simultaneously. Umar sober, but when we get to Reish Lakish, behema b'chayel lav le'evar momedes, meaning that the only moment that the animal's body and its limbs become Eivim and Achai is only after you remove it from the rest of the live animal. And therefore, according to Reish Lakish, in this very, shall I say, paradoxical case, you're going to get Malchus for Treifa and not for Eivim and Achai. And why is that so? Because the Isur Eivim and Achai is not Chal when the animal is born. It's only Chal after you pluck the limb from the live animal. And at the moment that the animal was born and Yotza Rubo, at that moment it became Treifa. So it would only become Eivim and Achai later on when he plucks the Aver from the body of the animal. And then we're going to apply the principle of Ein Isur Chal Isur, Ibai Same. But now we have another transmission of Abai's analysis of the Machlokas Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Kuli Alma, even Rabbi Yochanan would agree that Behema B'chayel lav le'evar momedes, and therefore the Chalos Isur Eivim Achai only emerges after the limb was plucked and separated from the animal's body. So what then is the Machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish? Because after all, now we're holding that even according to Rabbi Yochanan, the Isur Eivim and Achai is only Chal later on when you pluck the limb off the body, whereas the Isur Treifa already was Chal the moment the animal was born and it became fatally injured. And the Gemara explains, "B'meisei Isur Ever Mechal Isur Treifa." Can the Isur of Eivim and Achai, which will emerge only later, after the birth of the animal, when you pluck a limb off its live body, and the Isur of Treifa was Chal immediately before the Isur Eivim and Achai, before you pluck the limb off, when the animal was born. So now the question is, will the Isur Eivim and Achai, which comes later than the Isur of Treifa, would it be Chal, or do we apply the principle of Ein Isur Malch? Mar Sover, Osi Isur Eivim Achai Isur Treifa. Rabbi Yochanan holds that the Isur Eivim and Achai is Chal on top of the Isur Treifa. And Rashi explains, because of what's called an Isur Mosif. If the second Isur adds something to the first Isur, for example, Eivim and Achai adds to Treifa. Treifa is only also to Yisrael, whereas Eivim and Achai expands the scope of the Isur to include even a Ben Noach. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, Isur Chal Isur. And the Isur Eivim and Achai, that's an Isur Kolel, now is Chal on top of the Isur Treifo. Marsov, what Rabbi Reish Lakish holds, Lo Osi Isur Eivim and Achai, the Chayla Isur Treifa. He doesn't accept this principle that if you have an Isur Kolel, then it will be Chal on top of and subsequent to the original Isur, which is less, which is more limited, has a smaller scope. Ibai Sema. Now Abai offers a third possible hesber for the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. The Kuli Alma. Now we go to the other extreme, that even Reish Lakish agrees that behema b'chayel levarma omedus, which means that the Isur Eivim and Achai is chal the moment that the animal is born, even without plucking the limb. Ukigon shenitra foliacham mikan, and subsequent to the Leda, the animal became a treifa, it was injured critically, which means that surely the Isur treifa comes after the Isur Eivim and Achai. Sequentially, it came later. Ubemese Isur treifa chal Isur Eivim and Achai come. If the machlokas is, can the Isur treif be chal subsequent later on top of the Isur Eivim and Achai? Mar Sover Osi v'Chayim. Now, why would Rabbi Yochanan hold that the Isur treif is chal on top of the Isur Eivim and Achai? And the only answer to that is that Rabbi Yochanan holds Isur chal al Isur, and we've already seen in the past that there is such a shita. Umar Sover Reish Lakish holds saying Isur chal al Isur lo Osi v'Chayil. You see, in this particular case, there's no way of saying that treifa should be chal on top of Eivim and Achai. On the contrary, Eivim and Achai has a more expanded scope because it applies even to Ben Noach. But treifa doesn't have any element of kolel or chamur to add on top of Eivim and Achai, and therefore Reish Lakish says Ein Isur chal Isur. Now we're going to introduce a fourth explanation of the machlokas Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan based on a statement of Rav. So let's just summarize that. If you compare the first transmission of Abai to the last transmission of Abai, you ask yourself the question, at what point did the animal become treifa? In the first transmission of Abai, the animal became treifa at birth. In the last transmission, it became treifa subsequent to the birth. And therefore, in the last transmission, we're going to have to introduce, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Isur chal al Isur. Rav Amar Kagon Shetolash Mimena Ever Utrafa Bo. Interesting. If we're going to assume that Behema B'chayeha Lav Le'evar Momedes, which means that Evar Nachai only emerges when you pluck it, how then can you justify Rabbi Yochanan, who says that both Isur Machal, and the answer is that Chal simultaneously, because when he plucked the limb from the body of the animal, that's when it became a treifa, which makes a lot of sense. You know, we had long discussions back in Elu Treifus about, you know, can the animal live without this? Can it live without that? You know, certain let's say a spleen, may live without a spleen, but it can't live without, you know, without a gallbladder, or without lungs, and so forth. All the anatomy that we had then. So the Gemara now, in the name of Rava, analyzes the machlokas. Marsa Rabbi Yochanan holds behema b'chayeh beivarim ena omedes. So that means it only becomes Eivim and Achai after you pluck it. And at that point, when you plucked it, that's when the animal became a treifa. Isur Eivim v'Isur treifa b'hadi adodikasi. So we have no problem in Isur chal Isur, because both the Isur Eivim and Achai as well as the Isur treifa emerge simultaneously. Marsavar, but Reish Lakish holds be'mechayel levar momedis. Okay, if levar momedis, then it's only at birth that the animal becomes osur b'toras Eivim and Achai. At birth, right? At birth. Why? Because again, at birth already, each limb is designated as a separate independent entity unto itself, because Be'ema B'chayev what do you call it, levarmomedes, and now it became a treifa when he plucked the limb, but that limb was already also v'toras Eivrim Menachai during the lifetime of the animal, based on the fact that le'evarim omedis. V'lo osi isa treifa v'chala iser aver. Now, although it's true that you plucked the aver and then it became a treifa, but it was that limb was already Eivrim Menachai v'toras and iser Eivrim Menachai even before you plucked it. So it became a treifa only afterwards, and therefore ein iser chal iser. Rav Chia bar Abba Rav Yochanan, Achal Chelev min Achai min Atreifa. Here you have an overlap of three different lavin. Number one, it's Eivrim min Achai. Number two, it's Chelev. And number three, it's Treifa. So to our surprise, according to Rav Chia's transmission in the name of Rav Yochanan Chayv Shtayim, and the Gemara objects, Amalei Rabbi Ami, Dilma Valema, Mar Shalosh, Shani Omer Shalosh. I heard from Rabbi Yochanan a different transmission. I heard him say that you have three sets of malchus for violating three separate isurim. And Itmar Nami, we also have a transmission from Rabbi Avo in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Ochel Chelu Ben Achayim and a Treif Chayv Shalosh. So now the Gemara wants to know, in these two distinct and mutually exclusive transmissions of Rabbi Yochanan, what are they arguing about? Why does one think that, yeah, you could be chayiv 3, and the other thinks you could be chayiv 2? You go and shenitrafa im yitzias ruba. We go back to that first scenario of Abaye, if you recall, where immediately at birth, the animal became a treifa. Okay, so now we can certainly say that there could be a simultaneity of all three lavin. And that's Rabbi Yochanan, Man Diyom Shalosh, because so Levar Medes. So if it's Levar Medes, then the Iser Eivrim and Achai was chal immediately with the birth of the animal, even before the limbs were plucked. And it became a treifa at that very moment when it was born. So immediately from the moment of birth, you have an overlap of three different lavim, argues Rabbi Yochanan. You've got Eivrim and Achai, because Behema B'chayel, Eivarim Omedis, you have Chelev, because Chelev is chal immediately when the animal is born. I mean, that's a whole discussion unto itself, but let's just assume that premise. And it became a treifa because it got injured at the moment of its birth. Now, the fact that Chelev is also from the moment that the fetus is born is really problematic, because we have to assume that Chelev doesn't apply to the fetus in its mother's womb, only when the fetus is born. And that's based on a pasuk Kol B'Behema Tochelu, which we go back to the old sugya that the shechita, the mother, is valid for the fetus, and therefore the fetus becomes mutter, even its chelev. Okay, I'm just throwing it out there. That's a controversial sugya. So now we're up to the other version of Rabbi Yochanan, who says that you're only chayev shtayim. Umad yomer shtayim kasaver behema v'chayel lav levar momedes, which means that the Yisur Eivrim Menachai is only chal later, subsequent to the birth, when you pluck the limb. The Yisur Chelev, the Yisur Treifa Iko, but Yisur Eivrim Menachai lo osi chayil. Says Reish Lakish, you cannot apply. You have to apply the principle of Eidi Sechal Yisur, And although at the moment of birth you have the Isa Chelev, and because it became injured, the Isa Treifa both chal simultaneously, but the Isa Menachai is only chal later during the lifetime of the animal when you pluck its limb. Iba is saying, but the Gemara now offers a different approach to the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about this tripod case. Dekuli alma behema b'chayel lav levar momedis, which means that the Isser Eivim Menachai is only chal when you pluck the limb. So although the Isser Chelev and the Isser Treifa both chal simultaneously at birth, the Isser Eivim Menachai will be chal subsequently. Uvemaisi Isser Eivim chal Isser Treifa kom mifligi marsavas echayel. Now again, why would Rabbi Yochanan hold that the Isser Eivim Menachai is chal on top of the Isser Treifa and Chelev? And the answer is because it's an Isser Kolel, and it's also even to Bnei Noach. Or you could say that Rabbi Yochanan holds Isser Chalalisa. Marsa v'lo asichaya, meaning, according to the other version of Rabbi Yochanan, I'm sorry if I called it Reish Lakish, but anyway, according to that other version of Reish Lakish, you're only Chayiv Shtayim because Ein Isser Chalalisa applies even in the case of an Isser that has a more extensive application, namely Eivim Menachai, that's also even to Ben Noach. Ibay Seima. A third explanation of this machlokes between the two versions of Rabbi Yochanan. The Kuli Alma Behema B'Chayel Levar Momedis. Everybody agrees that the Isser Eivim Menachai emerges with the birth of the animal, from the moment it comes into this world. But what is the machlokes? Kagon shenitzufal yachamika. Right? It got injured after it was born. And therefore what we have is that the Isser of Eivim Menachai and the Isser of Chelev Menachai is chal immediately with birth, but the Isser Treifa is only going to be chal later down the line, subsequently when the animal suffers a critical vital injury. So what is the machlokas now? Can Treifa be chal on the Isser Eivim Menachai kom mifli marsa rasi chayil midi dehavi achilin? Okay, so now we're stuck a little bit, and it becomes complicated. Why? Because why would the Isser, assuming any Isser chal Isser, why would the Isser Treifa that came later when the animal was injured, subsequent to its birth, why would it be chal on top of Eivim Menachai? And the answer is because the Isser Treifa is going to be chal on top of the Isser Chelev. And once the Isser Treifa is chal on top of the Isser Chelev, then we drag it along, and it's chal even on the Isser of Eivim Menachai. Midi dahavi achelev. Di Omar Mar. Okay, so this is a Gemara in Zvachim that Rava has a drasha to prove that the Isser of Treifa, or the Isser of Nevela, is chal on top of the Isser Chelev, because at Torah Amra, there's a drasha that teaches us that Yavo Isser Nevela v'yachal Isser Chelev, and Yavo Isser Treifa v'yachal Isser Chelev. Now, this has to do, there's a famous Reb Chaim Brisker with the connection between Nevela and Treifa. But in the Psukim, you'll find Nevela and Treifa written in the Psukim. In the footnote, he quotes the Pasuk. In Vayikra Perek Zayin, it says, V'chelev Nevela v'chelev Treifa ye'asa. So it has both Chelev, Nevela, and Chelev Treifa. And therefore, since according to Rava in Masechtes Zvachim, the Isser of Treifa, the Isser of Nevela is chal on top of the Isser of Chelev. Therefore, we apply the same rule to the Isser Treifa. And like Nevela, which is chal on Chelev, so to Treifa is chal on Chelev. The Idach, what about the other version of Rabbi Yochanan, according to which you're only chayiv for two malchus? Chelev u'dechayil. You should not, in this context, compare and derive conclusions from chelev. And why is that? So here, Abosai, when we turn to Amid Beis, we'll get into a concept which is called Huter Mechlolo. That's a Shas concept. But before we get into that, the basic point here is that if you find a kula, then that kula could lead to a chumrah. What does that mean? We're going to find a kula in chelev, and then we're going to say as a result of that kula in chelev, nevela could be chal on top of chelev.